We're going to have a look at these 350 markers. So one of them is subculture, the other one is formal curricula, and the last one is cultural capital. Formal curricula hasn't come up before. Anti-school subcultures and subcultures come up quite a few times. So outline and explain how anti-school subcultures develop. So it's a 50 marker. So as always, we aim for 3 paragraphs. With this one, I'm initially going to start off with a definition. So with anti-school subcultures, it's when the norms and values of a small group, so it's when the norms and values of a small group are in opposition to the school. So they're often deviant. Anti-school subcultures when the norms and values of a much smaller group are in opposition to the school. They're often considered deviant. And it can often hinder achievement or attainment, generally having an impact upon achievement. So there's only 2 paragraphs for this one. Normally we aim for 3. But one reason subcultures are formed is in response to racism. One reason subcultures are formed is in response to racism. Shane found in the study of gang girls that they had developed confrontational attitudes. They developed confrontational attitudes and created an all-Asian subculture where white students and teachers were excluded. They had developed us and them attitudes. They developed us and them attitudes. As they had experienced racism. And formed this subculture. Which was used as a survival tactic. So Shane, with Shane, we're going to do Mirza. Mirza found in her study of black girls that they had rarely encountered open racism, but were held back by the well-meaning but misguided behaviour of most teachers. For example, the help was often patronising and counterproductive. Curtailing both career and educational opportunities. So, for example, they were entered for fewer GCSEs. And given stereotypical career advice. Basically, it was about music or sport, even though those students had shown no interest in those subjects, because it's a Yeah, it's an assumption because they were of colour. So those two, a bit more detail. This shows that anti-school subcultures can be formed due to racism. It can be a survival strategy. It can provide cultural comfort. I haven't done so, but it can be a survival strategy, and it can provide cultural comfort. It's a way, it's an alternative to provide support, but it still hinders progress in education. So if you remember in Shane's, Mers's, they were very, very pro education, but they were anti-school. So they wouldn't ask for help during a lesson, but they would do additional work outside of it and support each other. But that still hindered their progress because the other one might explain to them, I don't know, that theory, but the teacher probably would be able to do it a little bit more succinctly. Okay, paragraph 2. So a second reason why subcultures are formed is for the working class to gain status. So we've got Archer, so it's Professor Louise Archer. So for Archer, she looked at the Harkton boys. And found that they were anti-school and had anti-SWAT attitudes. They considered reading and education to be soft. They all thought if they worked hard, they would be labelled. Sorry for the both sexist and homophobic language. Both thought they would be labelled as pussies. Apologies, folks. And therefore did not want to make an effort to learn. Because I think that's really homophobic and sexist. It makes me think of working class boys often experience homophobic bullying. So I'm just going to pop in Epstein. I know she doesn't talk about groups, but also found that working class boys often experience homophobic bullying or being negatively labelled if they are hardworking or engaged. So it just kind of flows, I think. Just make sure you remember that one. And then with Archer, I'm going to put Jackson. So working class girls. So in Jackson's study, she found that ladettes displayed anti-school and were in serious danger of underachieving. It's not cool to be clever. We're in serious danger of underachieving because of our attitudes that it's not cool to be clever. And in lessons, they're often cheeky, disruptive, and loud or gobby. Remember as well, they were also open about their heterosexual sex lives. So by open, I mean they would openly discuss it in classrooms when someone's trying to teach. A bit obsessed with Pythagoras. So they're regularly in conflict with teachers. want to teach a lesson, and that's going on. So this shows that anti-school subcultures, check the question, this shows anti-school subcultures develop. So working class groups can gain status via alternative means if they are unable to achieve in education. They will award status through deviant or alternative acts. So basically, it's normally when working class can't gain status, so you know you're not going to get the A. So therefore, you award status through other means. Generally, though, you're not going to get the A because you're not trying. So it's kind of this circle of frustration, I'm sure. So anti-school subcultures as a 15 marker. Formal curricula. This is the formal curriculum. So this is just the formal curriculum. So what you teach, or the content taught to pass an exam. So basically the formal curricula, that's how it's said in the spec or in your 15 marker grid. The formal curricula is just the content needed to pass an exam. So I do that as like a little definition to start this. Paragraph 1 is going to be the formal curricula can disadvantage ethnic minorities. So it can disadvantage ethnic minorities by being ethnocentric. Ethnic minorities by being ethnocentric. So, Stickley et al. Studied 30 comprehensives and found that Afro-Caribbean youth resent the invisibility within the curriculum. They resent the invisibility of Black culture within the curriculum. That a focus on white history and white achievements. A focus on white history and white achievement. They resent Black history being reduced to a study on slavery. So remember, to be British is not to be white. And also when I showed you things like colonialism, British history should really look at different perspectives. Not one that's just pro kind of white and pro white British achievements. You know, we colonized 2/3 of the world. Perhaps we should learn about it a little bit more. So we've got Stickley et al. And then you've got Cord, who found that the curriculum is ethnocentric. The curriculum is ethnocentric. It ignores ethnic and cultural diversity. Ignores ethnic and cultural diversity. And promotes attitudes of little Englandisms. It focuses on past glories. I would put glories in little. Past glories of the Great British Empire. And again, I probably would put Great British Empire. Again, if you know the colonial history and you understand that, countries were impoverished for decades, probably would resent hearing about the Great British Empire. So this shows that the formal curricula can disadvantage non-white groups. It can disadvantage non-white groups as it might not be as familiar. So kind of divorced, beheaded and died, divorced, beheaded, but just might not. Let's not make assumptions. The formal curriculum might not be as familiar, and it can mean that groups resent the content and won't engage as a result. It can also mean that groups resent the content and won't engage as a result, won't complete the essay, won't want to listen, would want to disrupt. It can ultimately disadvantage non-white groups. Okay, paragraph 2. The formal curricula can disadvantage. It can disadvantage girls. So we're going to do Kelly. Science is packaged as a boys' subject. Science is packaged as a boys' subject. We still use gendered narratives, some male pronouns, and masculine examples. In the 1988 Education Reform Act, introduced a large amount of coursework. So introduced a large amount of coursework. And Bishop et al. Argues that 53% of teachers found that 53% of teachers felt there was a difference in boys' and girls' ability to complete coursework. Therefore, the curriculum, the formal curricula, may have disadvantaged boys. Don't do the girls outperform boys in subjects where there is no coursework, don't need evaluation. And here I'm just going to put Mitos and Brown found that girls were more motivated and hardworking, and boys struggled with deadlines. So girls are more motivated and hardworking. Boys generally struggled with organisation. It was organisation, wasn't it? So, because what I'm going to argue there is that if girls are more motivated and hardworking and boys struggle with organisation, again, assessments / coursework might benefit girls. Kind of trying to tie that in a little bit. So, this shows the formal curricula perpetuates gender stereotypes. The formal curricula perpetuates gender stereotypes, and this can disadvantage girls in physics and maths. And previously, assessments can have given girls an advantage, thus causing gender inequality in education. So basically, the curriculum for science and maths can disadvantage girls, and previous assessments can also help to explain gender inequality in education. Just check the question. So it's disadvantaging. The coursework is disadvantaging the boys, and potentially the science and maths disadvantaging the girls. There's only 2 paragraphs for that one. And have to get a little bit more kind of creative about adding in a couple more there to just kind of beef it up a bit. So this one is basically a pink paragraph. This one is a green ethnicity paragraph. And then subcultures is its own separate thing. It's not in different grids. It's in its own little pack, just to remind you. Okay, impacts of cultural capital. Cultural capital is a 15 marker, but also cultural defects is one as well. Basically, this is having cultural capital, or cultural capital is having a cultural advantage, or an advantage in in your norms, values, language. So when you've got an advantage, and it gives you ultimately, an educational advantage. So basically having an educational advantage, having norms, values and language that ultimately benefit you in education. Norms, values, language that are a benefit in education. That's cultural capital. Capital is having something. So Marx always argued capital was economics, so money or things that can generate profit. Bourdieu kind of develops it. He's not technically a Marxist, but felt that capital or having an advantage could be cultural, could be attitudes, norms, language. So if it's defects, you just change it around and argue that some groups don't have cultural capital and they don't have language, which gives them an advantage. So paragraph 1, we're going to argue that cultural capital can have an impact on class attainment. Will have an impact on class attainment. But cultural capital can have an impact on class attainment. So we're going to do Bourdieu. He's French. Found that middle class groups have cultural capital. Middle class groups have cultural capital. They have the knowledge, attitudes, and cultural experiences that ensure success in education. They have the knowledge, attitudes, and cultural experiences to ensure success in education. He also argues because often teachers can perceive cultural capital as intelligence, which is quite an interesting point. It puts middle class children it gives them a distinct advantage. It gives them a distinct advantage. So we've got Bourdieu, because he created the term cultural capital. With Bourdieu, we're going to put Gurwitz, because she's also class. Gurwitz found, this is Professor Gurwitz is female. Gurwitz found that middle class parents are privileged skilled users since they have economic and cultural capital they're privileged skill choosers. They've got both economic and cultural capital. Because they've only really got 2 sociologists. With Bourdieu, I'm going to do, he also notes that habitus is the expectations of your social group, and it can either be an advantage to the middle class or a disadvantage. It's the expectations of your social group. And it can either be an advantage or a disadvantage, because it can either encourage or discourage. And that the working class are often subject to symbolic violence. Where their culture and language can often be devalued by teachers. So give Bourdieu a little bit more, because I've only got these 2 for cultural capital. So at the end of that paragraph, this shows that cultural capital can have an impact in education. It means that working class groups are not as familiar. It means that working class groups aren't as familiar. And do not possess the experiences and attitudes that can ensure success in education. You can also put they're often subject to symbolic violence, which means they often disengage as well. But yeah. Cultural capital for class. Cultural capital has an impact on ethnicity and attainment. So we're going to go to the green ethnicity grid. For Gilbourne and Ball, cultural capital acts as a shield. Cultural capital acts as a shield against racist setting and streaming. Cultural capital acts as a shield against racist setting and streaming. Because it's all really about racist setting and streaming, I'm just going to add in Pilkington, who found evidence of racially discriminatory practices in the allocation of pupils to sets. Potentially also Gilbourne. Black males are often seen as a threat, seen as disruptive, and 3 times more likely to be excluded. I've gone off a little bit because only one of those out of the 3 mentions cultural capital. So I need to really make sure it comes back to cultural capital in the this shows. So this shows that cultural capital can act as a shield to prevent middle class black pupils being excluded and allocated into bottom sets. Cultural capital can act as a shield that prevents middle class black pupils being excluded from school and allocated into bottom sets, where their grades are restricted, or where grades would be restricted. So cultural capital has an impact because if you're middle class and of colour, or children of colour, you're much more likely to be able to resist racist setting and streaming. Therefore, you can limit the impact. Of cultural capital. Okay, so done. Everyone who mentions cultural capital. I also remind myself that cultural capital is language. So my third paragraph is going to be a language paragraph because cultural capital is language advantage as well. So language can be a cultural advantage. Language can be a cultural advantage. Bernstein, this one's going to be a mixture of grids now, found that there are elaborate and restricted language codes. Teachers, textbooks, or teachers and middle class groups often use elaborate, and it can cause a language barrier. Going to do Bernstein, elaborate and restricted, and Modood. The Bangladeshi, so he found that Bangladeshi and Pakistani students tend to struggle with a lack of fluency. Bangladeshi and Pakistani students tend to struggle with a lack of fluency. It can be a particular issue when English isn't spoken at home. So if you're dual language and you speak maybe Urdu at home and English at school, it can cause a bit of a lack of fluency. So struggling to understand, or may struggle to understand maybe the context or content being taught. So Driver and Ballard, gone to language. Also know it's attitudes and parental attitudes. So Driver and Ballard found that South Asian parents have high aspirations for their children and really push them to work hard and be successful. Remember, it's parental attitudes as well. So you could, maybe instead of language, do parental and Douglas instead. So this shows that cultural capital can have an impact in education. It can prevent, or it may, please be very careful with language, it may mean that students struggle to understand teachers, textbook and exam questions. It may mean that students struggle to understand teachers' textbook and exam questions and therefore struggle with the content needed to pass. Let's come back to that because I find that's a really impactful way. So language, cultural capital for ethnicity, cultural capital for class. Again, cultural capital, very popular. It also comes up as cultural defects. Not a great phrase, but I would use exactly the same sociologists, except in that this shows some students is arguably lack cultural capital. They lack cultural capital for ethnicity, therefore they don't have the shield to protect them from bottom set, and may lack cultural language, so may lack culture in terms of language, which means they might not be able to engage with the content as much. But defects is a horrible term. Formal curricula, as I've said, hasn't come up. I don't think that one's bad at all. And anti-school subcultures has become about 3 times. So any questions, let me know.